Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brian Sazi, Yahoo Finance's executive editor, and we're here to dive into a key topic from Chapter 2 of the latest World Economic Outlook, the Great Tightening, lessons from the recent inflation episode. Really amazing work here. Over the past years, of course, supply chain disruptions and shifting demand patterns have fueled inflationary pressures across the world. We have all lived through this and experienced it. But how do we make sense of these trends and what do they mean for policymakers and central banks? In this session, we'll explore new IMF research on how inflation is spread and how different policy responses can be most effective. I'm thrilled to be joined by two experts who have contributed to this very important work. M&A Boss, Division Chief in the IMF's Research Department, and Jorge Alvarez, Senior Economist at the IMF's Research Department. They will help us unpack these findings and discuss how they can shape future monetary policy decisions. Lots to cover here. Let's dive in. Emily, let me start with you here right off the jump. We've had a really long, or I would say 3-4 years of prolonged inflation. A lot of consumers have had to live through this. Help us understand what happened and how did it start?
Hi, Brian. Good morning, and thanks for taking the time to discuss the chapter with us this morning, and for your kind words too. That's a really great question to kick off this discussion. So let me start by saying that first, at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, many businesses closed. You would remember those days. When they opened, it was hard for them to ramp up production quickly, and this was partly because of challenges in supply chains. So during this period of lockdowns, when people started to spend again, obviously they couldn't spend on services. Instead, there was a big surge in demand for goods. You may remember the days that we all wanted to replace our TV sets, right? So the next shift in demand after this period came when the economies reopened, and a pent-up demand for services was then released after people not being able to travel or eat out in restaurants for a while. So here, let me also add the war in Ukraine because it led to a global food and energy crisis. And the resulting surge in commodity prices was an important contributor to overall inflation. So basically, a defining feature of this episode was these sectoral dynamics and the fact that key sectors hit their supply bottlenecks. A good example here is, we saw capacity in ports decline exactly when many of us wanted to, consume more imported goods. So another crucial element here was stimulative monetary and fiscal policy. Of course, these policies were essential in trying to contain the economic fallout from the pandemic. But at the same time, these policies meant that people had more money to spend, and that boosted demand gradually over time. So this widened further the supply-demand imbalances and led to further inflation because capacity was still constrained at that time. So basically, to sum it up, demand pressures interacted with widespread supply bottlenecks and caused the highest levels of inflation, global inflation, that we've seen since the 1970s.
Emily, I very much remember those times. I did buy a new TV. I did gain 10 pounds, and suddenly I had all this computer equipment that I never had before. So it was just a very big moment personally, but of course throughout the world. I mean, times nobody really have lived through before. But let me pick up Jorge on something that Emne said. She mentioned the Ukraine impact. I know this was an area of focus for you. How big a role was the war in some of the trends that Emne was just talking about?
No, thank you, Brian, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, first of all, it is important to mention that inflationary pressures started even before the war, in particular countries specifically. Now, that being said, the war indeed played a key role. First of all, it induced price spikes in key commodities and energy prices, notably in Europe because of the reliance on gas imports from Russia, because gas was used as an input for energy production and that cause price spikes. And because energy is used as an input for many production processes, this turned into wider inflationary pressures. Now, something interesting this time around is that even though the magnitude of the energy shock was quite remarkable, the magnitude of the pass through into broader inflation measures was not that much out of line when you compare it to the historical experience. That is, the magnitude of the pass through was not that much. Now, when we look and decompose the inflation from a more macro view, we do see that commodity price spikes and energy price spikes, along with spikes in other sectors where we saw a lot of movement, really drove most of the inflation, specifically on the way up. But these price spikes spread and became embedded in more fundamental measures of inflation, such as core inflation, which is a measure on just food and energy prices. So we really focused on this chapter on trying to understand that mechanism and how these specific price spikes start spreading in the economy. But this is hard. This requires us to look beyond the traditional aggregated inflation measures and output measures that we macroeconomists normally focus on, and really even look into new modeling techniques, such as the one developed by our team for this work. Our hope is that by better understanding that mechanism of how price spikes in particular sectors might spread in the economy, that might make us better prepared to face all future shocks wherever they come.
Jorge, let me stay with you here. As you're conducting this research, was there something surprising or unusual that you found in terms of how economies, I guess, behaved as a result of this inflation?
Sure. No, that's a very good question. I think there are at least three observations that were perhaps a bit surprising. The first one is that we saw changes in the relationship between inflation and economic activity. This is what we call the Phillips curve. So, a remarkable observation even before the pandemic was that this relationship had been relatively flat. That is, we hadn't seen that much movement in inflation relative to the output movements. But this definitely changed. The relationship between inflation and economic activity shifted after the pandemic. And this is something that we see in pretty much every country that we look at, both in advanced economies, market, and developing economies. Now, the second surprising observation perhaps was that the same steepening of this relationship was not really observed when we look at wages instead of prices. So nominal wages did increase, but they did not keep up with inflation. And because of this, real wages actually tended to fall, especially early on in most countries. In fact, if you remember, several people were speaking about fears of potential wage price spirals materializing. And I think those, to a large extent, did not really materialize, at least not in a widespread manner. It was the case this time around that just labor markets and wage pressures were not really the main drivers of inflation dynamics. And then a third, perhaps surprising thing was the behavior of inflation expectations. So the magnitude of the inflation shock was quite remarkable. It was quite large, but medium-term inflation expectations remain relatively stable or well anchored, if you will, in most countries. This has not always been the case when you look at the historical experience, and this greatly aided to bring inflation down eventually. So instead of inflation expectations or labor markets driving the story, it was really the role of these price spikes, including the ones from the war in Ukraine, and how they spread around throughout the economy, what really mattered. But properly understanding this is not easy, and it probably requires us to collect better data and to look at better modeling techniques, such as the one we try to implement in our chapter. But we believe there is room for improvement there.
In managing this from policymaker perspective, I'm sure hasn't been easy as well. Emily, let me get back to you. How did policymakers respond to all this?
Of course, policymakers responded by tightening monetary policy. But I think what was really remarkable this time around was how global this response was across countries. Of course, the exact timing and the pace varied across countries because every country had a slightly different specific set of circumstances. And these differences in their circumstances resulted in some emerging market and developing economies such as Brazil, Chile, and Mexico to start hiking their rates a little bit earlier. But others, had a more tempered response, at least initially in the beginning. So in our analysis, we asked the question of what would have happened to inflation if all other central banks delayed their tightening? So in this hypothetical world, we find that the delayed tightening of other countries would have slowed down the disinflation process significantly, and especially because it would have resulted in higher inflation for commodities. So why would this happen? Global tightening that we saw reduced demand for tradable goods at a global scale. So this includes for commodities, obviously, and such tightening policies put downward pressures on the prices of these tradable goods in a more effective manner. So also thinking about these spillovers from the perspective of, open economies that are vulnerable to prices of global goods, right? If you think about, for example, the low-income countries that are highly exposed to fluctuations in the global food and energy prices, and they have fairly limited policy options to respond to them, these positive spillovers were especially important. So I'd say the global aspect of policy tightening was particularly helpful for low-income countries.
Was it more potent or less potent that you had a lot of major economies rowing in the same direction in terms of policy to fight inflation?
It was the global aspect of the response made it more potent, because then the tighter policy could put downward pressures on demand at a global scale, which then was more effective in bringing down the prices of tradable goods, including commodities especially.
What do you think policymakers should draw from your chapter?
So we basically say that the policymakers could draw a new lesson, and we also confirm an old lesson here. So starting with the new lesson first, the new lesson is that when supply bottlenecks are prevalent and when they interact with strong demand especially, the relationship between inflation and economic slack, what we call the Phillips curve, steepened. This was something that my colleague Jorge also touched upon. And why is this important? It's important because it means that policy tightening becomes very effective in bringing down inflation without causing too much pain, meaning without causing too much output loss or unemployment. So it makes then sense to respond early in those kind of situations. And second, the old lesson is that if the supply issues are contained to specific sectors, and we call them in the chapter, run-of-the-mill supply shocks, the old wisdom of targeting sticky prices works pretty well. So basically, we don't have to throw out everything we knew about monetary policy making. So the new lesson can then be integrated in the monetary policy frameworks during the upcoming reviews of those frameworks. So to be clear, the policy frameworks overall worked pretty well. And the many fears that we had during this episode about, say, the de-anchoring of inflation expectations did not materialize. So this is not a call for revolution, but an evolution to make the frameworks more nimble, especially as we enter a world with potentially more frequent and larger shocks, especially on the supply side.
Jorge, last one to you. What do you think central banks should do differently?
Oh, good question. So as Amina mentioned, one of the lessons is that when supply bottlenecks are widespread, as we saw in the recent experience, this can present a favorable trade-off for central banks, where perhaps tightening can bring inflation down with more limited output costs. And that presents at least two actionable items for central banks. The first one is that the central bank's frameworks could define the conditions under which this favorable trade-off appears, where this Phillips curve that Amina mentioned steepens. Perhaps this can be implemented through the use of well-defined escape clauses, for instance. The second actionable item is really working on better data collection and better modeling techniques, because correctly diagnosing the conditions under which this favorable trade-off appears, in this case for more tightening, maybe is stronger, it really requires richer multi-sectoral models with a richer multi-sectoral view of the economy. It requires better sectoral data, and this would really allow us to both better diagnose what the underlying forces behind inflation are. It would allow us to improve on the forecasts that we use, and that would ultimately allow us to better fine-tune the monetary policy response. Now, we believe that a step in the right direction would be to more frequently collect sectoral prices and sectoral indicators, along with the monitoring of supply bottlenecks indicators, to better diagnose what these conditions are occurring. And also, there is merit in collecting better information on the structural factors of different sectors, how they set prices, how flexible prices are in the different sectors, and how the different key sectors are connected in the macro economy. Now, as Amina said, we want evolution, not revolution. So it is important to highlight not only what they should be doing differently, but also what they should keep doing. And that is really maintaining strong and credible monetary policy frameworks. Those were invaluable this time around in keeping inflation expectations well anchored, which greatly aided the inflation fight.
This is just really great, insightful work, very important work. And I just want to thank you both for letting me be part of this discussion. I learned a lot just reading it and being in this environment. Thank you very much, Emine Bas and Jorge Alvarez, for sharing these very valuable insights. Again, very critical topic at a critical time. If you'd like to dive deeper into the findings of Chapter 2 of the World Economic Outlook, the Great Tightening, lessons from the recent inflation episode, please visit imf.org. There you can access the full report, additional resources, and more about how these insights can shape monetary policies. Thank you for tuning in.